Hello, thanks for being in a new video. This time I have full review of the VIVO V30 SE. Let's get started. This device has no official distribution in Mexico, but they have sent it to me so that I can get to know it and review it. Its launch price in Colombia is 1,799,900 pesos. That is approximately $470, although remember that the prices there are not the same as here. In fact, it is curious because in Peru it has a much lower price, 1,299 soles. That is approximately $345. So it is a bit complicated to analyze a device that has no official launch in Mexico for the reference price. In fact, some competitors appear on the screen, but they will not necessarily be those. It is only more or less approximating the devices that would be in a similar price range. But what we all have very clear is that it is a mid-range device that we will know below. On the front we will find a simple design with a flat screen. The bezels are thin enough to talk about a mid-range device. Even the bottom bezel, despite being a bit thicker than the rest, is still thin enough to draw attention in terms of aesthetics. Notice that it has a cutout for the front camera that is centered, so it looks modern enough. In aesthetic design, I think it's okay. Although in resistance, I'm not so sure because it doesn't integrate some Gorilla Glass protection or even some Scott Sensation glass, which is what VIVO usually uses in high-end devices. So we are not so sure how resistant the screen can be to any fall. We will also find the power and volume buttons on the right side, which is a plastic frame with a highly reflective metallic look. On the top we find only a microphone, while the left side is completely smooth, without any buttons or anything additional. In fact, it serves to see that it has a thickness of 7.79 millimeters, positioning it as one of the thinnest devices of the moment. At the bottom we find the speaker, then the USB-C port, then a microphone, and finally the tray. In this tray you can place 2 SIM cards or a SIM card and a micro SD card, although this may vary depending on different distributors and regions. On the back cover we will also find a very nice design, in this case with a synthetic leather finish in this purple edition. However, there is also a black edition that has a glass back cover, so the weight of the device may vary from one version to another. In this case, the device I'm holding in my hands weighs in at 191 grams and the glass edition is a bit lighter. But notice how not only is it a faux leather cover, but it also mimics the stitching on the edge to give it a much more elegant touch, not only to the eye but also to the touch. So it's a nice device to hold in the hand, despite the fact that we find a completely flat back cover, which is usually a bit more awkward than curved covers, but being such a thin and light device, it's not going to bother you in reality. The camera module is surrounded on this little plate that has a very nice satin design. So aesthetically it's a device that I did like, and in water resistance it has just the right stuff. It doesn't come to surprise, but fortunately it has the IP level of 54 to resist splashes, although it can't be submerged. The screen is going to give us a very good image quality. Its size is 6.67 inches, very traditional in the smartphone market. But in this case, the remarkable thing is that in this price range, it is not so common that AMOLED screens are integrated, and in this device we will find it. This type of screen will give us very intense colors, very high contrast, and also good viewing angles, so that even viewing the content from the side, we still have a good level of visualization. In addition, it is a screen compatible with HDR content, so some areas of videos or compatible content can emit more brightness. So the screen is able to reach a peak of 1800 nits when viewing this type of content, showing us much more realism and definitely giving us an excellent image quality. The resolution is Full HD plus 1080 by 2400 pixels to be exact, and again it will give us a very good sharpness, reaching a density of 394 pixels per inch, which is already a very high number, so that even the text you can see them with a good sharpness. This screen also has a good level of brightness for good viewing of content outdoors, and the lower brightness can become comfortable for use in the evenings, but it should also be noted that within the accessibility options we would also find the option of extra dimming, so you can still further reduce the brightness of the screen, resulting in a super comfortable experience at night. And speaking of comfort, it also integrates the eye protection filter, which is usually very common in several devices. It also integrates the dark theme and has different screen color calibrations for you to choose the one you like the most. Although in this aspect, at the time of representing the white color, it is also noted that it is not an AMOLED screen of the highest quality, but it is appreciated that in this price range we can see this type of technologies. In addition, it is a screen that will offer us 120 Hz in its refresh rate. Therefore, the movements look very fluid and smooth and can be adapted to change to 60 Hz in static content environments to not consume so much energy. Regarding the sound, in addition to the main speaker that is at the bottom, this device also integrates a speaker in the earpiece area for calls, so that it is able to give us stereo sound, although it is not too powerful or of an exaggeratedly high quality, but for the price range I think it meets very well. Join me to listen to a small test, although remember that it is not the same to listen to it live. As you can see, the device has an additional gain mode if you want to turn up the volume to the maximum, although it can generate a bit of distortion, so use it only if necessary, but it does boost the power significantly. However, the bass frequencies do not seem to stand out too much, and it does not have an equalizer that allows us to try to modify the sound a little more to our liking. In fact, it does not have Dolby Atmos either, so there are important absences in this device. The feature that it does have is the super audio resolution, which would be able to give a little more sharpness to some sounds in case you get to enable it. It also has experience customization, whereby you would be able to tailor the sound depending on some specific headphones with live models. You can also customize how you perceive the audio to have a better perception of it all. So these are options that in some ways could help your audio experience a little bit, but it's not high enough. But despite not integrating Dolby Atmos, they interject an alternative that they call Super Audio, where we will find some surround sound presets, but I insist that no equalizer is available. Even with headphones connected, the equalizer does not appear, so it is clearly a weak point. Also, as you saw, there is no integrated headphone jack, so you need to use the USB-C port to connect headphones via cable, or use Bluetooth headphones instead. In this case, the highest codec they have available is aptX Adaptive, so you could have a higher resolution audio if you have compatible headphones. So I think the experience is fine, although in the price range I think it would be much better to have a headphone jack. The device integrates two microphones, the basic and expected in this price range. Below you will listen to a test recorded with it.
Esta es una grabación realizada con el dispositivo llamado VIVO V30 SE.
From my point of view, it's a simple recording that even just recording voices generates some distortions because it tries to reduce noise. But next we will listen and watch a video recorded with this device, setting the sound system in my living room at maximum volume to see how it would behave in these environments. In this case, it seems that the distortions are not that noticeable, so it could still pass as a good device for recording in very noisy environments. The front camera on this device is 16 megapixels and has f2.0 point aperture with fixed focus. The device does not have a quick shortcut to access the camera when the screen is on, but when it is locked you can double press the volume down button to access it, although it has to be enabled in the settings. We are going to find the regular capture speed, but what bothers me personally is that when you rotate to the front camera, it immediately accesses portrait mode. So some results might look strange if you don't realize that you have the blur effect enabled. So this effect you have to be constantly turning on and off. I would like it better if it would immediately enter traditional photo mode, but the device gives preference to portrait mode. Within the traditional photography mode, it will offer us a button to access some color filters that we cannot preview. We will also have access to some different lighting effects for our face with artificial intelligence, so you can get to have a good result in this sense. But if you want more options, you must access the portrait mode, where we will also find the beauty mode options with many parameters. For starters, we can choose from some beauty presets, or we can directly access parameter by parameter to modify our face. In fact, it has many modifications for our face type and also for some other things like the size of our nose, the lips, and many more parameters. So Vivo is one of the manufacturers that offers more options in terms of facial beauty options. In fact, in this button we will also find more options where we can see some different styles of colorization of our photo. There are also the same filters and lighting effects that we saw in the other mode. In this case, it does not bring the posture templates that we did find in other devices from this manufacturer. In addition, in the settings, there are other options to enable the shutter from different ways, such as touching any area of the screen through voice commands or showing the palm of the hand. But I insist that it is an option that comes turned off by default. The front camera of this device during the day seems to me that has a good behavior, has a very good level of detail, although it is curious that in some areas of the photograph seems to see a mesh due to the low resolution that has this result. It should also be noted that the lens has a very specific focus, so you must be at a very specific distance from the lens, so that it can come out with a good focus. If you are a little further away from the camera, you start to come out a little more out of focus and with less detail, and I insist that the pixels get to be displayed in a very strange way. But this style of focusing will also produce that in group shots most people come out slightly more out of focus than they should, so it's not such an attractive front-facing camera device. Likewise, if you're too close to the camera, you'll appear completely out of focus, so it can't bring out details of your face. In backlit scenes, the preview doesn't look optimized, but afterwards it does do some good processing to balance highlights and shadows well, so that makes it very good quality. Indoors, the photography is of good quality, but again it looks with a simple but acceptable result. Colors are fine, although they are not as accurate, and you will also notice a greater presence of noise, especially in the darker areas with low level of detail. At night something similar will happen, although fortunately it manages to pick up a bit more detail in the face, but you will still notice a bit of noise, especially in the darker areas of the photograph. In backlit conditions, where it is an exaggeratedly complicated result, the result is still attractive enough because of the balance of highlights and shadows, although it is not a photograph that is of much quality. But if you compare it to other devices in the price range, I think it manages to come out rescuable in this scenario, which is very complicated. In fact, you can also use the screen as a flash simulation to better illuminate the face, but the colors get to look too pale, so it is not so recommended to take pictures in such complicated scenarios with this device. However, with a better lit setting, you can even have good night portrait photos, although the difference between the foreground and background is very noticeable with respect to the noise level, since the foreground appears with a lot of noise, while the background appears completely out of focus. Then it gives a bit of a strange feeling, but it does take good portrait pictures. However, when reviewing portraits during the day, we also realize that it is not able to focus on the objects in the foreground, giving a rather strange feeling, so it is advisable to take portrait pictures without any object nearby to have a better result. On the back we will find the ultra-wide camera of 16mm with 8 megapixels in its sensor and f2.2 aperture. In addition to fixed focus, it is a simple camera but can be functional. Then we find the 26mm camera, that is, a camera that could be considered as a main camera. Its sensor is 50 megapixels with f1.8 aperture on the lens and autofocus. And finally, the macro camera, which is 2 megapixels with f2.4 aperture and fixed focus. So you have a traditional system for the price range. Next, we're going to try to capture number 3 to test the capture speed that this device has. We'll make a second attempt, and on both attempts we're viewing the rear screen to try to see what it would look like in the real world. But the next attempt will be viewing through the cell phone that's taking the picture, because as you notice there's a little bit of a delay between one and the other. And that delay is noticeable because when you try to take the picture at the exact moment by looking through the cell phone can leave a little out of phase, but if you are visualizing the real life you could get to capture the exact moment and even a little before it happens. The device also has a burst, but it only allows us to take 10 pictures, so it is extremely simple and takes almost a second to start, so I think it is very likely that you will miss the exact moment with this simple burst. In the bottom right corner, we are going to find a button where we can access some color filters or lighting effects for portrait shots. We can also tap on screen to adjust the focus or exposure, but for more parameters we can access directly to the Pro mode where we can have many more options like exposure compensation, ISO that can go up to 3200, shutter speed that can go up to 32 seconds. We are also going to find the white balance and the type of metering, and something I like is that it does support RAW photography, which is something uncommon in devices of this price. To scan documents, it is necessary to enter the specific mode that will serve us for this action called Documents, and in it notice that automatically detects the edges of our document to make the cut. But we are talking about a very simple scanning is only a cropped photograph, unlike other devices that are betting on optimizing color, lighting, and even export to PDF with multiple pages, so it is a simple scanning. And note that you cannot scan QR codes from the main camera interface, but you can access Google Lens with the access in the upper left corner, and through this tool you must still press the search button to finally execute the action of this QR code. Then it takes 2 additional steps, unlike the devices that do allow us to access directly from the main camera interface. The device integrates a high resolution mode to take pictures of micro texts, and then if you get closer you can notice a little more details, although honestly it is not something as spectacular as we have seen in other devices that also integrate high-resolution sensors, so I would say that this one does not get to take full advantage of this sensor. The moving pictures, I think it manages them in a good way because it does not seem to have a blurry effect so marked maybe in some areas of maximum speed, but the result is fine and the ultra-wide camera achieves something very similar. But analyzing the outdoor result of the ultra-wide camera, observe that it generates too much chromatic aberration in the edges, so it is a camera that really offers us a very basic quality despite having good amplitude. But if you are one of the most demanding in photography, you will surely notice and you will be annoyed by this type of distortions or chromatic aberration. The main camera performs better in this aspect, although it also generates a bit of chromatic aberration, but it is not as visible as in the ultra-wide camera. In addition, some noise still remains here, but fortunately the level of detail is good enough and the color rendition also becomes acceptable. This device supports a maximum 10x zoom, but first we look at the photograph with an intermediate zoom 2x, where it's not able to preserve optical quality, so again it doesn't quite take advantage of the 50 megapixel sensor. Now you're looking at a picture with 5x digital zoom, and finally the maximum 10x zoom, where it looks very forced, so the zoom looks very simple. Indoors, I like the color rendition that the ultra-wide camera does. Quite accurate with respect to the warm color that the environment had at the time of the photograph, although obviously it is not able to have as much level of detail as we would find in the other camera. Notice that the main camera gains a lot of detail but loses that warm color rendition that was in reality. So, I think it lacks a little bit of accuracy in color rendition, but fortunately it does have a good level of detail even in these scenarios where there's not as much lighting. And in backlit scenes, in my testing, it had a bit of a strange result. Notice that the preview doesn't look burnt, but on the contrary, the shadow area looks a bit darker than it usually does, and the result is pretty much the same. It's curious that the shadow area came out so dark, so it looks like it doesn't perform as well in terms of dynamic range, at least in this test with the main camera. Because it notes that with the ultra-wide camera, it managed to balance highlights and shadows better, although you see a somewhat exaggerated HDR effect. And also, since it is the ultra-wide camera, it generates a lot of chromatic aberration that in these backlit scenarios becomes much more noticeable. And at night, with the automatic mode, we are going to have a good quality using the ultra-wide camera. In fact, it's funny because with the night mode, I feel that the device has a little bit more artifacts on the edges and in the darker areas. But with the automatic mode, it's a little bit cleaner picture. So it would be best to use the automatic mode. The main camera gains more detail as usual, but note that some noise is still present, in this case without night mode. And with the night mode there is not too much difference. You still notice a little noise, maybe it seems that it tries to eliminate it a little more, but it does not want to sacrifice the level of detail, and I think the result is good. Especially for the good balance that makes the most illuminated areas. Interestingly, it also lets us use the night mode with 2x zoom. First you are seeing the result without night mode, and then with night mode to notice the difference in color. But unfortunately the level of detail is not so high, it looks a bit artificial, this sharpness. For macro photography you have a specialized camera, although the result is simple in terms of color and blur effect. In fact, you appreciate a lot of noise also in this photo. so it is not so spectacular as it is low resolution. From my point of view, it would be more appropriate to take a picture with the main camera applying a little digital zoom to have a little more uniform focus and keep good colors and a very nice blur effect for the background. So the macro camera I consider useless because I like to use the main camera better. Just consider that you're going to have to zoom in because the camera can't get too close to small objects. But by zooming in, you can get those results I showed you. And if the ultra-wide camera's amplitude seems insufficient or you don't like that all this chromatic aberration is generated at the edges, remember that you can also use the panoramic mode that will help us to have better definition, better detail, less chromatic aberration. Although you gain horizontal amplitude, you don't have as much vertical amplitude as in the ultra-wide camera. And finally, for portrait photography, notice that we have a little bit more saturation compared to the automatic mode, and unfortunately it's not able to detect foreground objects, so portraits really come out with very little realism. Even the edge detection on the person, notice that they are a bit blurry or cloudy, so the result definitely that I didn't like. For video recording, we will find a basic full HD support with all cameras, except obviously for the macro camera, but it is expected in this price range. The curious thing is that we also have some buttons in this part to change the color of our video. Although the resolution will drop to only 720p, so it is not so recommended to record using these filters. We will also find some other simpler color filters, but again the video resolution drops to HD, so the colors would only be recommended for some very simple videos. Interestingly, it also offers the beauty options that we saw in photography, although again the video will drop in resolution, but we can manipulate several parameters, although not as precisely as we did in photography. Touching on screen, we can adjust the focus or exposure, and it does not have any professional video recording mode. And when we start our recording, we will have a button to take pictures, also another button to pause and resume our content. But it does not have a button to rotate the camera without the need to stop our video recording first. Finally, it also has a slider for zooming, although it does not have direct shortcuts to a specific zoom, and it does allow us to turn on the flashlight while we are recording our video. This device has full HD recording capabilities, so it's within what is expected in the mid-range. It's a simple video, the color rendition is slightly pale, but I think it's still considered acceptable. Fortunately, you don't see that you have aggressive exposure jumps in this type of simple video, so the recording looks good quality. Obviously, with the ultra-wide camera, you're going to have less detail, even though it also records in full HD with this camera, but you don't see as sharp an image. Curiously though, the colors do look a bit more saturated and with better accuracy compared to the main camera, which is quite strange, but it's not as recommended to record with this camera due to the chromatic aberration that was also seen in the pictures. Indoors, you will again notice that the ultra-wide camera has a good color rendition, although in these scenarios you do start to notice a lot more noise and also some jumps in exposure. Plus the video is running at 28 frames per second, possibly to pick up a bit more light. But the main camera has a very strange color rendition, not something I liked. You see paler colors even though it manages to reduce noise a bit better, but it is not so recommended for recording if there is not good lighting nearby. Regarding backlit situations, if it is a light backlight, I think it does get a good enough balance with both cameras, but I insist it must be a light backlight. Because if you go to an area where the backlight is much more aggressive, you will notice that the device with the main camera still manages to have a good balance because it does not give so much emphasis to the face unlike other devices. So you don't notice aggressive jumps in exposure when it detects or fails to detect the face, but it might come out a little darker than we'd like. On the other hand, the ultra-wide camera does detect the face and therefore sacrifices many parts of the illuminated area that get overexposed and completely burned out if it detects the face. So it's not as recommended for recording in these environments, but no device at this price point will be. And notice how at night the ultra-wide camera has too much noise and motion looks very strange because it goes at 25 frames per second. It is really not a recommendable camera. It has poor balance in the brighter areas, and the darker areas it is not able to light even using its flash. So it is very easy to record with this camera at night. The recommended thing to do is to record with the main camera, which, as you will notice, manages to balance a little better the more illuminated areas, and when you move to the darker areas, it still manages to collect a good amount of light. And what I like is that it also has good noise control so that the darker areas still look dark. So the main camera I did like for night recording. Regarding stabilization, fortunately it does have a digital stabilization mode that helps for when you're walking, and even when you're running, it still manages to compensate well enough for movements so that it's not a disastrous result. Notice how it makes a difference when you turn the stabilization off, and even when you are walking the movements are very aggressive, and obviously when you are running it will be a very bad result, so make sure you have the stabilization on if you are walking. By the way, with the ultra-wide camera you might be able to disguise these fast movements a little bit better, but with the main camera maybe it's a little bit more complicated to stabilize when you're running. If you're walking it's fine, but if you're running it will be very complicated, and obviously if you have the stabilization disabled the movement will be even more noticeable. Regarding the zoom, if you record with the ultra-wide camera it won't let you apply even a little bit of zoom, but if you record with the main camera, as in photography, it will let you get up to 10x, but obviously it will be fully digital zoom, so it's a simple zoom that fortunately is not seen to zoom in with very aggressive steps, and the stabilization could also become acceptable. The device also integrates a fast camera mode with a result in Full HD, but the most basic is 15x, which may be a little fast for movements of people. Fortunately though, the video is seen to go at a good bit rate per second, so it maintains a good definition. The fastest is 960x, so if you could get to record landscapes and more spectacular results, then fast motion did appeal to me. On the other hand, the slow motion is only in HD, so it's basic slow motion at 120 frames per second, but for some Instagram posting or something similar it could be useful. The focus when you're recording seems to be good, it responds quickly to aggressive movements. Obviously you shouldn't be so close to the camera if you want a bit more precise focus, but on useful movements it could lose focus, especially on small objects. But that's to be expected in this price range. We didn't expect much more advanced recording. And the front camera cannot record in 4K either, so it stays in Full HD at 30 frames per second, but without stabilization, and that definitely produces a pretty bad result that you cannot enjoy too much. In addition, the backlight behavior is also simple, but the curious thing is that it lets us apply zoom, although not having autofocus. Obviously, you will not be able to get too close to the camera to keep a good detail. But as I say, the backlight behavior is not good because it will overexpose and completely burn the most illuminated areas, so it is a very simple camera. In fact, you notice that even without walking the movement feels very aggressive, and indoors it doesn't have as accurate colors, it's a little bit simpler colors and not as much detail. So at night the result is going to look a little bit weirder, especially because it goes down to 18 frames per second to try to capture a little bit more lighting. So all the movements look very slow, you also see little definition because of this, and the colors look a bit paler. Although interestingly, if you go into the darker areas, the device does manage to pick up a good amount of light, considering you're not using the screen as a flash simulation and compared to other devices. So despite having quite a bit of noise, fortunately it does illuminate better in darker areas. The front camera doesn't offer you slow motion or fast motion, but it does have a dual view mode through which you can place the front camera and the rear camera in the same recording in Full HD. Although obviously without stabilization, so it could be a bit strange movement. It also doesn't let you reposition the floating rectangle, although it does have focus enabled and also has zoom enabled. But zoom without stabilization is a bad idea, so the result is simple, and although it does let you rotate the cameras, you must first stop recording and start it again to do that action. Likewise, if you want to move the floating rectangle, you must stop recording and start it again. But that position will be totally fixed while you are recording video. And it also integrates a circular mode if you prefer that shape, or also a heart mode that works exclusively in portrait format, which could be useful for recording some stories for Instagram. This device comes with Android 14 and on top of the phone touch also in its 14th edition, so we have the latest from both Android and Vivo, but unfortunately Vivo doesn't give us a clear update policy for this device, so we don't have the certainty whether or not it's going to update to Android 15 and later versions. That for me is definitely a weak point. But let me tell you about the additional features that this system will have, because as you can see, it comes with a different aesthetic than the rest of the devices to differentiate itself a little bit. So for starters, we have a good selection of themes that will also modify the aesthetics of the lock screen to have much more customization to our liking. We will also find a feature called Always On Screen with different styles that we can apply, clocks and covers to show that content even when we have our phone locked. In fact, we can also download more covers with all these options for free. Interestingly, the device also allows us to change various animations of the system, so we can access a fairly extensive customization, including also the effects of ambient light that will light up the edges of the screen when we receive a notification. So there are many options that we have to change the style of our cell phone, including also the charging animation or animation when connecting a USB cable. So I insist that it has many customization options. Also note that it also has a smart sidebar that allows us to immediately access some applications and will do so through floating windows, although unfortunately you can only run one window at a time because if you try to open two, one of them will be minimized. Fortunately, it is compatible with applications such as YouTube or Instagram, which generally do not have such compatibility in this type of mode. So you can get a good level of productivity, especially if you combine it with the split screen, where you can have up to 3 applications open at the same time, but it is not the most advanced in the industry, where manufacturers like Samsung can open many more applications in this mode simultaneously. The device also has some shortcuts and gestures that we can use to enter the split screen, or there are also some ways here to access the floating screen as we saw a moment ago, which is simply dragging towards this corner. Then it also offers several mechanisms for interacting with the device to make it much easier to use. Also gestures to take screenshots or to turn on the flashlight, answer calls and other things. And it also has an option called Quick Action, which will allow us to hold down the volume down button to do some specific action. So it offers a good variety of controls. And regarding the one-handed mode, note that fortunately it not only resizes vertically, but also horizontally, so that you can easily reach other items on the end of your device as well. It even has a facial beauty option for video calls, compatible with WhatsApp and some other apps. And within the gallery, we also have a photo editor, which in turn includes an object eraser, although it is completely manual. So it does not immediately detect the objects you want to delete, but you must draw their entire outline. And note that the editing is done simply by taking into account the patterns that are around it, but it is not a generative artificial intelligence, but only a feeler. So it's much simpler than other devices, but this eraser is available. You can also select multiple photos to create a collage without the need to download some other applications and without any waterboat. In fact, the collage, notice that it has several styles that are much more varied than other devices I have seen. So the collage maker, I think, is very sophisticated. It also includes a considerably advanced video editor, because notice that you have linear editing with various videos that you can add. You can crop, add frames, add music, filters, text and much more. So it's a good enough editor, totally free and included with this device. And speaking of videos, it also includes a button to compress these recordings so that they use less internal space. So for example, to send a video over the internet, if you want that action to be faster, you can quickly compress the content from this device without installing external applications. So it has interesting options, although overall it's an operating system that feels simple. It also integrates this nano music player as a kind of additional widget, and you can select whether you want it to use the music app or the Spotify app. This device has an optical drive on the Z-axis, so interaction with the whole system feels pretty straightforward. But in this price range we couldn't get too picky. Regarding security, note that it integrates a fingerprint reader inside the screen, which is not exaggeratedly fast, since we are talking about an optical fingerprint reader and not ultrasonic. So it's definitely not going to be the top of the industry. But for this price, we couldn't get too demanding. It supports up to 5 enrollments, so you can enroll multiple fingers or people you trust. And you can also change the animations as we showed a moment ago. And in addition to fingerprint unlocking, you can use facial unlocking, although on this device itself there are warnings that it is an unlock that is not as secure as others. Then it is only in 2 dimensions and could be circumvented with relative ease. Fortunately, it does allow us to illuminate the face a little better with the screen, although it does not bring the option for you to choose whether or not you want to have your eyes open. So, for convenience you could use it, but for convenience it is more advisable to use the extended unlock, which will allow you to select trusted devices or places so that the device is not constantly locking but remains unlocked. The included password manager is the one from Google, and as you can see, it does ask you first to verify through your fingerprint that it is you before filling it in, but it doesn't seem to work very well in some fields, so the experience is not satisfactory. It also has no secure folder or child mode. But within the security section, we will find an option to encrypt access to applications. So you can select which applications will ask for your fingerprint or a code that is different from your lock screen, or you could also hide applications directly from your home screen. This device does not have a specific VPN, but it does come with a malware security scan in collaboration with Avast, so you can be confident that you are not just relying on Google's Google Play Protect, which sometimes fails a lot. It also has the option to clone apps, so you can use 2 instances of these on the same phone, but in case you ever lose your phone, you are completely dependent on Google and its own implementation of Find My Device. In addition to the digital wellness options are also made and customized by Google to analyze the time you use in each application or control the device of your children, in addition to setting a time to go to sleep or a mode without distractions to raise your productivity and not be distracted so much on the phone. Finally, the emergency functions are also present, where you can fill in the necessary information, or also remember that by pressing the on-off button 5 times you could get to initiate an emergency call. The battery is 5000 mAh, a usual capacity in the smartphone market, but in this case there is a rather strange behavior regarding the consumption of this battery. Running in the foreground my battery drainer, it discharged in about 4 hours and 42 minutes. So it performed what a battery of this capacity should perform, showing us a good performance. But putting this drainer in the background while watching videos in the foreground with YouTube, the performance was a bit complex. While it reached 8 hours, which is quite remarkable, it must be said that it constantly closed the battery draining application. It evidently detects that it is consuming too much power and prefers to close it. So it has a pretty strict background app management, although manually you can set how you want it to behave. So in this case I left it on smart control, but you could tell it not to restrict any of this activity. However, your smart control I think is too aggressive, because I've seen other devices that without closing background apps manage to have very extended battery life, so it is likely that some applications will close in the background and you have to keep reopening them. In this case, it does have a standard power saving mode and a super power saving mode, so you could extend your battery life for quite some time. In the super saving mode, you will notice that it will restrict many more options on your device, disable access to the location, and also give you access to some applications that you consider essential. There are 8 applications in total that you will be able to open, so it is an operation that can also be useful. This device supports a 44-watt charge, and the charger is included in the box. In my test with 15 minutes of charging, it recovered 26% power. In 30 minutes it got up to 48%, and the full charge was finished in 77 minutes. So it's good for the price. Obviously it will not have wireless charging or reverse wireless charging, and with respect to the battery protection mechanisms, note that it only has smart charging. That is, if you leave your device charging for quite some time, it will charge much slower to take care of the battery, but it does not have a manual charging lock, and as you realize, it is also able to show us the maximum capacity of the battery, although it could take several weeks to show us the first percentage. This device does have support for 5G networks, which is entirely positive, as in the price range it is still common to see some other proposals with support for 4G networks only, but this one already feels much more modern. Although in terms of Wi-Fi network it does not have the most modern, but at least it integrates Wi-Fi 5 with a decent download speed, although in this case it will not stand out too much. In fact, Bluetooth will not stand out either, because it only has Bluetooth 5, and that can be noticed when connecting an accessory. Perhaps not so stable if there are many people around you. It also does not integrate NFC, something that is becoming more and more usual in this type of devices, but here you still could not get to make mobile payments. It also does not integrate FM radio, something you might resent, especially because in this price range most devices do integrate this feature. You can connect accessories via the USB-C port, but it is not capable of projecting its screen via cable but only wirelessly, although this screen projection can be advanced, protecting your privacy, or projecting with the screen off, or simply projecting an image or a video, so that can be useful, but remember that it is only wireless. It will also support Android Auto, in this case both wirelessly and wired. And regarding the sensors, unfortunately I have some bad news, because even though it integrates accelerometer, geomagnetic field and orientation sensor, gyroscope and light sensor, actually the proximity sensor doesn't seem to work even when I bring it close to my ear. So apparently it's a virtual sensor that has a very poor performance, so you could end up experiencing a lot of problems getting the screen to turn off when you bring it close to your ear. That's probably its weakest point. The Vivo ecosystem still feels very limited, since in this case they are only able to offer us wireless headphones, but they do not offer us a very advanced interaction. They do not have a smartwatch, they do not have a tablet, at least in Mexico. So this device feels very lonely compared to other families of devices from other brands. Although being an Android device, it will obviously have Google technologies that allow you to interact with devices from other brands such as Quick Share or Google FastPay. But in that sense, it is confirmed that it is very dependent on Google, where we will also find Google Photos for backup, or we will also have to use Google Home to control home devices and more. So it is very dependent on Google, and I personally do not like that. Let's talk about performance. This device integrates a processor that we had not tested so far. We are talking about the Snapdragon 4 Gen 2, accompanied by 8 GB of RAM, and you can still add another 8 GB of virtual RAM, which we will test in a moment to see if they are well managed. In this case, it took just over 4 seconds on average to open each application, showing us that it's not very powerful. Let's also see if this RAM is well managed. Notice that at the time of returning to some application, it still came to load with good speed. So it seems that it does not have too many problems to be able to switch you between several applications. Unless you get this thing that's happening to me right now, it's a complete black screen. So it looks like actually the RAM is not that well managed. Watch how long it took for it to react again. So it's definitely not a device that's going to work in a good way for those users who like to open multiple apps at the same time. Notice how these black screens will happen, which are also very prolonged, completely ruining the user experience. So this is definitely the weakest point, and the point I could complain about the most, because it does come to spoil your user experience quite a bit. Notice how long it takes to react after you go back to an application. Obviously, this will not happen if you have few apps open, so the most recommended in this case is that you open a maximum of 5 apps at the same time, because otherwise you will have this kind of problems. But honestly, this is quite strange, because even having 8 GB of physical RAM, this would not happen. So it looks like this could be fixed with some update that we hope they will send, because the physical RAM seems to be ample enough to have this kind of problem. In this case, you can't disable the virtual RAM, and as you can see, it's another 8 GB, so supposedly in total we have 16 GB of RAM, but believe me, that's not noticeable at all when you're interacting with the applications on this device. This experience is quite exasperating, and we could say also frustrating for users who really want to offer a lot of speed. The device offers 256 GB of storage. This sense, yes, is a very good thing, because you can store a lot of pictures and videos on your device, and it even supports microSD up to 1 TB, which complements the storage space perfectly well. But now let's test everything together, both the processor and RAM and storage, to see how fast they reach exporting a video that joins several clips recorded with this device with a total duration of 1 minute in full HD resolution. And note that the process was repeated strangely. It had initially taken 21 seconds, and I do not know for what reason it is exporting again. Anyway, it shows us again that it goes very fast, but it seems that by a mistake it exported twice this content. So it can be a useful tool if you want to edit video, but in full HD. Obviously in 4K it won't have those capabilities. As for gaming, the device has this ultra gaming mode that you can access through the iManager. It allows you to enable or disable the sidebar of additional tools that are explained in this section. It also allows you to optimize the frames per second of some games, although not all of them are supported, but you could enable it to improve the fluidity, although they are disabled by default. So in this format we did the test. It also allows you to block notifications and mute calls to avoid any kind of interruption while you are playing. And note that swiping 3 fingers also allows you to open other applications while you are playing. When running a game, this toolbar will appear through which you can see the consumption that your CPU or GPU is having. You can also select the performance mode if you want to save battery or you want to give maximum power. We will also find the switches to modify the settings I mentioned a moment ago and buttons to take screenshots or screen recordings. Even if you slide 3 fingers up, as we saw, another panel will appear where you can open applications in a floating mode so as not to interrupt your game while you are running it. So it offers us a good number of tools, and in this case Call of Duty, by default it's going to give us the average quality at an average rate, but watch out because it does allow us to go up to a very high graphic quality even at a high frame rate per second. So the graphic compatibility is very remarkable, although it does not allow us to use all the effects in real time, but it does have an excellent compatibility. Unfortunately though, the actual performance drops a lot. It is quite bad to run it in this kind of quality, so even though it supports that quality, it's advisable to play in low graphics quality, because in this case we noticed very little stability and an exaggeratedly low frame rate per second. So it is something very similar to what we found in the Snapdragon 7, which despite being very good in compatibility, is very bad in fluidity. In the SpongeBob game, by default, it gives the medium resolution and high quality at 60 frames per second. In this case, we lower the quality to medium, and it should be noted that it does not have the image smoothing option. And in this case, curiously, the game did perform very well. So it could also influence who the developer of the game is. Maybe some developers take better advantage of some libraries than others. So, this game did perform very well in this quality, although I repeat, it doesn't have the image smoothing available, so that could also influence the performance quite a bit. But the stability was very good, although the heating could become a little higher than what we usually have in a device of these characteristics. When recording it to screen, the performance may decrease a little bit, but it's nothing serious. In the Legends game, we changed the automatic setting to a medium setting, going up to 60 frames per second to see what it was capable of. But unfortunately in this case, again, the experience was pretty bad. It lacks fluidity, it's not capable of hitting 60 frames per second, and at times of explosions it can feel a bit more of a drag, as the lowest peak was 17 frames per second. It is not that the game is constantly freezing, but the most demanding gamers will undoubtedly recognize that it is a device that is not going to give them the expected performance, especially considering that we do not set this game in exaggeratedly high qualities. And finally, in Henshin Impact, by default, it offers us the low quality setting, and in this case we left it on low, but we went up to 60 frames per second solely due to the poor performance we had in past games. But in this price range, we should have put a slightly more complicated test. But with this setting, we confirmed that if you set your games at a low graphics quality, you could still get a smooth enough experience. Again, it's not a gaming-focused device, but if you put it through a few simple tests, you could still get a little better gameplay. Although the heating could get to bother, since in this case it reached up to 44 degrees Celsius, something that we could definitely consider as a weak point, since the more the device gets hotter, the more it can reduce its ability to process these games. As a conclusion, it is a nice mid-range device which could get to take good care of its camera, which is not something ultra attractive, but for the price I think it stands up well in that aspect. The charging can also be a very positive point, as well as the screen, but it has some other points against it, such as the lousy RAM management, which is probably what makes me hesitate to recommend it. But for now we have reached the end of this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, you know you can tell us about it, and we'll see you next time.